In 1315, the rain started early. The weather turned cold. Crops failed across Europe. What little grain was harvested often came already infected, and the people, desperate, starving, ate it anyway. That was the beginning of the Great Famine. It lasted for 2 years. Millions went hungry. Some reports whispered of cannibalism, others of parents abandoning children. It was a time of darkness, dampness, and despair. And through it all, bread remained on the table, even if it came with madness baked in. Some people tried to stretch their grain supplies by adding things to the dough. Tree bark, crushed peas, even powdered roots. But these substitutions made the bread hard, bitter, and often even more dangerous. In towns and cities, bakers were sometimes punished for selling an underweight or spoiled loaves. But out in the countryside, no one was watching. There was no law to protect you from your next meal. And yet bread was more than just food. It was sacred. It symbolized the body of Christ. To eat bread was to be part of something holy. And when that bread turned against you, people felt that too. It wasn't just a spoiled crop, it was a spiritual crisis. Monasteries offered prayers. Pilgrims walked for days to ask saints for healing. St. Anthony, the one the disease was named for, had an order of monks dedicated to helping those who suffered, but there were too many, far too many. And while the holy men prayed, the peasants kept baking. Women, especially, bore the weight of this burden. In most homes, it was the women who milled the grain, mixed the dough, and watched over the hearth. If the bread turned out bad, if it made someone sick, who else would people blame? Rumours turned into accusations. Accusations turned into trials, sometimes worse. Still, you had no choice. Your belly didn't care about fungal spores. Your children were crying. The only thing in the pantry was rye flour, blackened at the edges. So you mixed it with water, maybe some old beans, and you baked. And you hoped. Maybe this loaf wouldn't bring the fire. Maybe this time you'd be spared. And so day after day, year after year, people fed themselves with something they knew might kill them. But there were no alternatives. No science, no safety net, just bread. Dark, bitter, possibly poisoned bread. And somehow, through famine, plague and madness, life went on. But what kind of society survives when its very food supply might destroy the mind? Let's stay with you for a while longer. You're still in that cold little cottage. The rain hasn't stopped for weeks now. Your boots are wet. The firewood is nearly gone. And your stomach is making the kind of noise that keeps you up at night. The last loaf you baked, it was strange. The dough felt wrong, clammy, too dark even for rye. But you baked it anyway. You had to. And now your youngest son won't stop crying. He says his legs hurt. He says he can't feel his hands. The community whispers begin. It's not just your child. Others are getting sick. The old man near the chapel had a seizure yesterday. A young woman collapsed while carrying water, said she saw her dead brother in the forest just before she fainted. A man in the next village hacked off 3 fingers, saying the devil lived in them. It's all happening again. People start praying more and blaming more. This isn't just hunger anymore. This is fear. When the bread is bad, nothing is safe, not your sleep, not your sanity, not your place in the community. And the scariest part? There's no way to be sure if the loaf you eat today will keep you going or take you down. There are no signs on the outside, no rotten smell, no mould you can recognise. Just a quiet invasion inside the grain, baked and steaming on your table. As more people fall ill, suspicion starts to rise. Maybe someone's sabotaging the flour. Maybe that new miller brought in cursed seed from another parish. Maybe someone has sinned so terribly that the whole village is paying the price. Superstition is a way of understanding the chaos. It fills the silence left by the lack of knowledge. And when superstition is the only guide, justice becomes fear in a different costume. Witches, curses, demons. All it takes is one accusation, and all of a sudden, the woman who baked her bread in secret, or the family that still has flour while everyone else is starving, becomes a target. And in an era with no true medical explanation for disease, food poisoning, or hallucinations, communities often turned on themselves. But let's look further out, beyond your tiny village. Across Europe, famine is digging its claws into every country. Grain stores are shrinking, prices are doubling, even tripling. For the wealthy, that means inconvenience. For the poor, it's the difference between life and death. Entire caravans of traders are robbed, not for gold, but for sacks of mouldy barley. People begin eating anything: boiled weeds, leather, sawdust soaked in broth, animal feed, and of course bread, always bread, scraped together from whatever flour substitute they can manage. The rulers and priests try to intervene. In England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, councils are called. Food laws are drafted. Bakers are ordered to use only clean flour, but there's hardly any left to use. Enforcement is rare and usually only in towns. In rural areas, you're on your own. Even monasteries, those ancient centres of charity and learning, can only do so much. They offer thin porridge, a bit of cheese, a bit of bread, if they have any to spare. But they're suffering too. Some abbots write of monks dying in their cells, fasting not out of piety, but because they don't want to take the last of the supplies. One chronicler, writing in Flanders during this period, describes how people feared the morning meal more than the night terrors. Why? Because by day you had to eat, and what you ate might make you sick. But starvation was worse. It was a cruel balance, a bitter choice, and it was made every single day. Millers too became figures of suspicion. They controlled the grinding, they handled the raw grain. If the flour was bad, it must be the miller's fault. In some regions, angry peasants rioted against the local mills, setting them on fire, or seizing the stores of flour by force. This wasn't just food, it was power, it was life, held in the rough wooden boards of a creaky windmill. And when people couldn't find real flour, they made do with mock bread. You take ground peas, a handful of hay, a few shavings of tree bark, you mix it into something vaguely dough-like. You bake it if you still have firewood, and you try to eat it. The smell is awful, the texture is worse. It sticks to your teeth and tastes like ashes, but it's warm, and you don't want to die, so you eat it again the next day. There's no poetry in this survival, it's just desperation, and repetition, and praying that your next meal won't betray you. In some areas, rumours spread of rich households having white bread, fine wheat loaves baked with butter and honey, served beside cured meats and fresh wine. These were fantasies for most, but they stirred anger. Hunger creates more than physical pain. It creates envy, it breaks communities. It makes people believe the worst about each other. The famine slowly drags on. People try to plant new crops, but the rain won't stop. The roads are mud. The fields are waterlogged. Horses and oxen die from disease. Some parents sell their children, hoping a monastery or town will feed them. Others abandon the elderly in the woods. And through it all, people keep baking. Because they must. Because there's nothing else. Years later, some survivors will remember those days as a fog. Others will remember the faces of the dead. But nearly all will remember the bread. The heavy, bitter, fear-soaked bread that carried them through hell and nearly broke their minds. But what happened when people finally did stop trusting bread? The famine eventually ended. Not with a bang, not even with celebration, but with a slow, quiet change in the weather. Around 1318, the rains began to let up. The sun warmed the fields again. Seeds planted with little hope finally took root. But recovery didn't happen all at once. The people were different now. Thinner, wary, changed. And the bread, well, it wasn't trusted the way it once was. You survived. Maybe you lost a brother. Maybe your children no longer laughed the same way. Maybe you couldn't eat rye without thinking about the fire in your hands or the nights you saw shapes in the corner of your eyes. Your village was quieter now. There were fewer people at mass, fewer voices in the fields. Life had returned, but something sacred had gone missing. Something you couldn't quite name. The loaf, once a symbol of God's provision and stability, had become a thing of fear. People began grinding their own flour more carefully. They sifted, insected, stored grain differently. Some buried their flour to keep it cool. Others dried it in ovens before storing it, hoping to kill off anything inside. It wasn't science, not yet, but it was learned behaviour, and that was a start. Monasteries, still reeling from the burden of caring for the sick and starving, began writing down more about what they saw. Some monks even noted the blackened grain, the hallucinations, the pattern. Quietly, carefully, knowledge began to grow, but it would take centuries before anyone connected the dots to ergot. In towns, bakers' guilds became more powerful, not just to control business, but to set rules, clean ovens, inspected sacks, training. In some places, these guilds introduced fines for spoiled bread. Some even held public demonstrations to show they were using pure flour. The trust had been broken. Now it had to be earned. And then came a new idea: bread as politics. City councils started requiring bread for the poor. They built granaries, huge public storage buildings, to hold surplus grain for emergencies. These granaries were often locked, guarded, even blessed by priests. They became symbols of civic pride and preparation. No one wanted another 1315. Still, the memory lingered, in the folk songs, in the stories told to children. Bread was no longer just a comfort. It was a warning, a reminder of how fragile everything really was. And not just physically fragile, spiritually too. Because during those hard years, when people ate the bread and fell into madness, faith had been tested. Why would God allow his own symbol, his body in a sense, to become poison? Why had churches failed to protect the people? Why had the saints gone saint? Tom said no more and was turned away from religion. Others clung to it harder than ever. Some blamed themselves. Others blamed strangers. The famine didn't just starve the body, it cracked the soul. And yet humanity didn't stop baking. In fact, over time, bread became safer. Millers learned better drying techniques. Grain rotation improved. People started combining grains, wheat with rye, barley with oats, to reduce risk. They learned, slowly, painfully, but they learned. Still, there's a strange echo of that fear in every loaf you break, every slice you butter, the trust you place in your food, how easily it can be lost, how slowly it returns. In some remote villages, stories were passed down for generations. A cursed crop, a loaf that made people dance until they died, a bakery that was burned to the ground after an entire family vanished. These were warnings, yes, but also memories, oral records of what happens when your only source of survival turns against you. Historians now believe that the events of the Great Famine and the bread crisis that accompanied it may have even helped set the stage for bigger changes. People began questioning the fairness of their systems. Lords who demanded grain while their peasants starved found themselves without workers. Some towns rebelled, some monasteries became more powerful, some withered into silence. Bread had become more than food. It was a reflection of justice, power, and care. When bread failed, everything else followed. And so the story ends, not with the eradication of ergo or a great discovery, but with small, careful adjustments. Better ovens, sharper eyes, public storage, less blind trust. But perhaps that's how most crises end. Not in grand revolutions, but in the quiet resolve of ordinary people who refuse to go mad again, who want their children to eat and sleep in peace, who want to believe once more that the bread is safe. So the next time you pull a loaf from the oven, warm and golden and harmless, maybe think of them, those who didn't know what they were baking, those who bit into darkness, those who saw the fire rise from the crust, and ask yourself, what do we trust today without even questioning it? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound of the sea, not the tranquil rhythm of waves on a beach, but the constant groaning sway of a wooden ship creaking under the weight of barrels, cargo, and too many men packed into too little space. It's 1342, and you are sailing aboard a merchant vessel bound from the southern coast of England to a port in Flanders. You're not a captain, not a knight. You're just a deckhand, or perhaps a ship's cook, and your day begins not with sunlight, but with the smell of rot. Food on board is always the same: salted meat, dried peas, hard biscuit, a little beer if you're lucky, and that's if nothing's gone bad yet. You rise from your corner of damp rope and head to the storage deck where rows of barrels sit in the dark like squat, swollen tombs. You pry one open. Inside is beef, or at least it used to be. It's floating in a thick brine, salt water and thyme trying their best to keep the decay away. But you know the truth. You can smell it. The meat is turning. Still, it's all you have. You fish out the greyest chunk you can find and toss it into the pot. Maybe with enough boiling and a few herbs, if you have any left, it'll become edible. Maybe not. You stir it anyway. On a merchant ship, food isn't about flavour. It's about survival. Everything is salted. Beef, pork, even fish. Salt is the only thing keeping it from rotting. And it doesn't always work. The salt can clump or sink or simply run out. And when it fails, so do your bowels. You learn quickly to avoid the worst barrels, but choices are few. For the sailors, meals are a grim ritual. They sit in rows on the deck when the weather allows, slurping from bowls, chewing with tired jaws. No one talks much. Eating is work. You have to soften the biscuit in beer or water before it cracks a tooth. The peas, boiled into a mush, offer little comfort, and the meat, always the meat, tastes like shipwood and misery. Water is precious. Too precious to drink much. It's stored in barrels, but it goes foul fast. A few days out it's already turning slimy, greenish. If you have beer, that's what you drink. It's weak, barely alcoholic, but it keeps better than water. When the beer runs out, and it always does, you pray for rain. You hold out your bowl and catch whatever the sky gives you, or you just drink the bad water and hope your stomach forgives you. The cook, if you can call him that, has no kitchen. He has a firebox, a small enclosed space where he can build a low flame. If the seas are calm, he boils. If they're not, he does nothing. Cold meals, cold meat, cold everything. Fires are dangerous aboard a wooden ship, so they're rare. Most of the time, food is just cold. Some of the men bring dried cheese or smoked fish from home. They guard these like treasure. A single onion can make you a friend. A dried apple, a king. You'd trade a knife for a lemon. You'd trade your boots for garlic. But these treats are rare, and once they're gone, it's back to the barrels. You try not to think about how long the meat's been in there. You try not to think about what part of the cow you just ate. You chew, and you move on. Below deck, the smell never leaves. It's a mix of salt, mildew, sweat, and food gone wrong. Rats scurry, flies hover, moulds grow on wood. There are no windows, no air, just barrels and rope and dampness. If a cask leaks or bursts, you clean it fast. That much salt in the bilge water will ruin the ship's planks, and if you can't fix it, that meat is gone, and that means someone goes hungry. Sometimes you anchor for a night in a bay or a quiet port. If the captain is generous or desperate, you go ashore to buy fresh goods, eggs maybe, a chicken if luck is on your side, bread, real bread, the kind you haven't seen in weeks. You eat it all at once, you don't save it, because on a ship nothing keeps. And then the wind picks up again, and the voyage continues. You're not a soldier, but you've heard of ships sailing to war with food even worse. Biscuit filled with weevils. Water so foul it's black. You count yourself lucky. You've only been sick once this trip, and you haven't lost a tooth. Yet. The days pass, the meat grows leaner, smaller. You start dreaming about onions, about stew, about wine and warm ovens. But when you wake, it's always the same. Hard biscuit, salted regret, and the groan of the sea. Still, something keeps you going. Maybe it's habit, maybe it's hope. Maybe it's just the knowledge that land eventually will come. But how many men have died with salted meat still on their tongues? The days blend together at sea. Sun, salt, wind, hunger. The ropes creak, the sails flap, and the sea is always moving, sometimes gently, sometimes like it wants to kill you. You eat the same thing every day in the same way, with the same tired faces around you. The salted meat is turning sour, the biscuit is hard as rock. The peas are mush, but not in a good way. You chew, you swallow, and you hope it stays down. Food storage on board a medieval ship wasn't clever. It wasn't efficient. It was just practical. Barely. Everything was packed in barrels, beef and pork mostly, salted heavily, stuffed in layer after layer. Some barrels weren't even sealed properly. If the wood warped or cracked, the saltwater brine could leak out, and the meat would start to decay faster, and there was no backup. If a barrel went bad, it stayed bad. You didn't throw it out, you picked through it. You hoped the bottom half was still good. Some men tried to get creative. The cook might hang fish to dry from the rigging. If the weather was hot and dry, the fish would cure in the open air. If it was wet, the fish would rot before it dried. Either way, you ate it, because hunger doesn't leave room for pride. When supplies ran low, captains would ration the food. Smaller portions, longer waits. There were no clocks on board, just routines. You ate when the bell rang, you didn't ask questions. If you asked for more, someone else got less. Fights broke out sometimes, over a chunk of pork, a half cup of beer, a scrap of bread someone tried to hide in their coat. Food was power, everyone knew it. And then there were the maggots. Yes, the biscuits. Those hard, flour-packed ship's biscuits were famous for it. Weevils laid eggs inside the flour before it was even baked. By the time you bit into it, those eggs had hatched. You didn't always see them. Sometimes you did. Little white larvae wriggling in the cracks. Some sailors tapped their biscuits on the table first to shake the bugs out. Others didn't bother. They just ate. The bugs were protein, after all. Below deck, things were worse. The food storage area was dark and damp. Barrels sometimes leaked, and the smell of rotting meat would settle in the air like a fog. You had to rotate the barrels regularly, check the brine levels, shift things around to prevent mould from spreading. If you didn't, everything spoiled faster. And when someone got sick, and someone always did, it was hard to tell what caused it. Was it the meat, the water, the lack of fresh air, the mould in the biscuit? A simple fever could turn into something much worse. Diarrhea, vomiting, delirium. There were no doctors aboard, just guesses. Herbs, if anyone remembered which ones helped. And prayers. So many prayers. The cook sometimes tried to disguise the worst food. He'd boil the meat until it broke apart, then mash in peas, stale grain, maybe some dried herbs. He'd call it stew. It wasn't. But it was warm, and that mattered. A hot meal could lift spirits, even if it tasted like brine and regret. You'd sit on the deck, bowl in hand, staring out at the endless blue-grey of the sea. Maybe someone would hum a tune. Maybe someone would tell a story. Probably one they made up, about roasted boar and honey cakes and a feast that never ended. Everyone would laugh, softly, and then they'd go back to chewing. Fresh food was rare, almost mythical. Sometimes a fishing line caught something, a cod, a herring. That was a celebration. The cook would gut it, grill it if he could, salt it if he couldn't. One fish for 20 men didn't go far, but it broke the monotony. It reminded you that the world had flavour somewhere. The lucky ships docked every few weeks. At port, the crew would resupply. They'd buy grain, dried beans, onions if they were in season, maybe even cheese. They'd restock barrels of meat, usually already salted. The new meat went on top. The old meat stayed below. No one ever threw anything out. The less lucky ships stayed at sea longer. If the weather was bad or the winds died, or pirates chased them off course, the journey could stretch on and on. Men wasted away. The food dwindled. Fights became more common. A barrel of salt pork might be all that stood between peace and mutiny. And when the voyage finally ended, if it ended, you stepped off the ship with a hollow stomach and a mouth that had forgotten how real food tasted. You'd walk into the nearest tavern, order whatever the cook had, and cry when the bread came out warm, soft, fresh, real. You'd eat with both hands, not caring who watched. You'd chew slowly like you were remembering something you forgot long ago. But you knew, deep down, that you'd go back to sea again, because money was there, or trade, or duty. And when you did, the barrels would be waiting, the salted meat, the hard biscuit, the foul water, and you'd start the cycle over again. But why didn't they find a better way to feed her, even your own mouth, salt and rot all the way down? You don't realise it yet, but you've come back from a voyage not just with cargo, but with damage. Your joints swell because you haven't had enough vitamin C. Your gums bleed for the same reason. Your stomach groans every night because of the spoiled meat you swallowed and the water you drank from barrels slimed over with algae. You didn't complain. You couldn't. You had a job to do. But now, on dry land, the cost begins to show. Some men never return from sea, not because the ship sank or pirates attacked, but because food failed them. Their bodies gave out. Some died from scurvy, though no one knew the name for it yet. They just called it the wasting or the sailor's rot. Others simply stopped eating. When everything tastes like rope and vinegar, hunger starts to feel like mercy. There were no great nutritionists then. No doctors with tablets and powders, just guesswork, folk remedies. Some captains kept lemons or dried berries if they were wealthy, or had sailed through places where they were available. But most ships, salted pork and biscuit. That was the way. It was tradition. It was proven to keep you alive, barely. Over time, the sailors changed, not just their health, but their thinking. Some learned tricks, catch rain in tarps and strain it through linen, pick out the weevils from the biscuit before anyone saw you, chew slowly, let the food sit in your mouth until it's softened, pray over the barrels, not just because of superstition, but because sometimes it was the only thing that made swallowing possible. Some men began to smuggle their own supplies on board. Dried plums, fermented cabbage, anything they could tuck into a bundle of spare shirts. The cook might steal a little extra onion for the stew if he liked you. He kept your friends close, your rations closer. Back in port towns, people knew the signs. A sailor who walked stiffly with red cheeks and sunken eyes probably hadn't eaten fresh food in months. They'd give you pity or charge you double, sometimes both. Eventually word spread. Slowly, quietly. Captains started adding dried fruits. Lemons when they could get them. Salt gave way to vinegar in some barrels. And in the biggest ports, new laws began to take shape. Requirements for food supplies, quotas for beer, water, dry goods. But it was a slow shift, a painful one. Generations passed before real changes stuck. And even then, the men kept sailing, because the sea doesn't wait. Trade didn't stop for hunger. Empires didn't care if your stomach was empty. The salted meat remained, maybe a little better packed, maybe wrapped tighter, but still there, still waiting in the dark. And what about the cooks? The quiet, thankless souls who stirred the stew and cut the spoiled bits away and tried to feed 30 men with 20 portions. They were rarely praised. No monuments stand for them. But without them, ships would have starved before they sailed half a league. They were not chefs. They were survivalists. And they fed the world one salted, steaming pot at a time. There are no recipes from those ships. No cookbooks passed down, just memories, smells, scars. The legacy of food at sea isn't delicious. It isn't grand. It's tired. It's practical. It's full of compromise and sacrifice. It's the reason empires grew and why some men never came home. So next time you unwrap a sandwich, fresh and soft and safe, remember the men who dined on meat so hard it splintered, water so foul it frothed, and biscuit growls before your eyes even open. That's normal. It growls every morning. You slept in your clothes. There's no pillow, just a sack stuffed with straw. Your breath fogs the air, even indoors. The fire went out long ago, and your wife is already up, stirring something in the pot, something that's probably the same thing she made yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. Pottage, that's what you eat every day, for every meal. It's not soup, it's not stew, it's somewhere in between. A thin, warm mixture of whatever grain you have, usually oats or barley, mixed with water, and maybe a few scraps of onion, leek, cabbage, or turnip if you're lucky. If you're very lucky, there's a bone in it. Not meat, just the bone, something to give it flavour. If the bone's been boiled a dozen times already, well, it's still a bone. Still flavour. There's no salt, that's expensive. There's no pepper, that's imported. There's no butter, unless it's spring and the cow didn't dry up. There's no choice. You eat pottage because there's nothing else. Beside the pot, there's a hunk of coarse brown bread. It's dense. It's dry. It's full of bran, sometimes bark, sometimes bean flour. It's dark not because it's whole grain, but because that's the sweepings off the mill floor. The good flour goes to the manor house. You get what's left. Still, you tear off a piece and dunk it in the pottage. It softens. You chew. You swallow. You eat quickly because work waits. You don't savour, you consume. And you wash it down. Not with water, which might be foul, but with ale. Weak ale, small ale, brewed at home with whatever barley was left from the last harvest. It's cloudy, sour, barely alcoholic, but it's safe. It won't give you worms or send you to the latrine every hour. Not like the stream water will. The kids get ale too. Even the little ones. It's normal. No one questions it. You don't drink to get drunk. You drink because it keeps you alive. You carry a small bit of food with you to the fields, a piece of bread, maybe a few beans. That's your midday meal. You eat it on a rock with dirt on your hands, sweat dripping into your collar. There's no lunch break, just a pause, and then back to the plough. Dinner is more of the same. Pottage, bread, maybe an egg if the hen laid one, maybe some dried peas or lentils stirred into the pot. If it's winter, it might be turnips every day for a week. If it's spring, wild greens, bitter ones. You boil them 3 times to make them edible. Sometimes, someone traps a rabbit. It's not legal, technically. It belongs to the Lord's land. But hunger has no rules, so you skin it, cook it fast, and bury the bones deep. If you get caught, you could be fined, or worse. But if no one sees, it's a feast. You don't eat cows, they're worth too much. You don't eat chickens often. You need the eggs. You don't eat pigs unless one dies suddenly. And when one does, it's a blessing. The entire village might come together for it. Salting, smoking, sharing. But that's rare. Most days it's pottage. Again. You grow what you can. Patch of onions, some leeks, a few beans, a cabbage or two. Everything depends on the weather. If there's too much rain, things rot. If there's too little, they wither. If they grow, you eat. If not, you starve. The manorial system doesn't care. You owe a portion of everything you grow to your lord, even if the crop failed, even if your child is sick, even if your thatch leaks. You give the grain, you give the eggs, you give the best of what little you have, and then you survive on what remains. You've heard of things like cheese, sausages, honey, spices. You've maybe smelled them at a market, maybe seen the noble servants carrying baskets filled with them. But those aren't for you. You're not a person who tastes things. You're a person who endures them. Still, there's rhythm in it. Comfort even. The pot is warm. The bread is filling, even if it's rough. The ale eases the evening. You sit near the hearth with your family. You listen to the wind. You watch the fire. You eat what you have. And you wonder, what would it be like to taste something sweet, something tender, something different? But tomorrow it'll be pottage again. You start to notice it in the joints first. The way your knees don't bend as easily. The stiffness in your back that doesn't go away after rest. You're not old, maybe 30, maybe less. But your body feels older. That's what pottage does to a person. That's what bread without meat, greens without fruit, and ale without variety will do over the years. Malnutrition isn't sudden, it sneaks up, quietly. You don't collapse in the fields, you just start to ache more, heal slower, catch colds more easily. And when the seasons turn and your vegetables don't grow, or your cow doesn't calve, it gets worse. You can't name the illnesses. No one can. No one has a word for anemia or scurvy. But you see it. Pale faces, swollen gums, children with thin arms and bloated bellies, a neighbour who hasn't walked in days, a grandmother who never got out of bed again. When disease comes, and it always does, it spreads fast. Coughs turn into fevers, fevers turn into funerals. You don't know why. You don't know how to stop it. You just keep boiling the pot. Keep feeding the sick whatever is warm. Keep praying that your family won't be next. Some say garlic helps, or leeks. Pottage, always pottage. The recipe never changes. You boil water, add grain, stir in whatever you've got. Onions? Great. Peas? Even better. Nothing? Then just water and oats. You boil it longer to soften it. You eat it slowly to make it last. Some women get stopped dreaming